Nuclear weapons need large facilities, but genetic engineering can be done in a small lab. The danger is either by accident or design. We can create a virus that destroys us. This quote is stated by the great Stephen Hawking. We affirm that genetic engineering / CRISPR should in fact have more regulations enforced by the government. To better understand this claim, I will be defining the words genetic engineering, regulation, and CRISPR. Genetic engineering is a group of applied techniques of genetic and biotechnology used to cut up and join together genetic materials and DNA from one or more sources and introduce the results to an organism in order to change one or more of its characteristics. Regulations being the rule or order issued by an executive authority or a regulated agency of a government. This will lead us to the question as to what regulations should be made by the government. CRISPRs are specialized stretches of DNA. A protein, Cas9, is an enzyme that acts like a pair of molecular scissors, capable of cutting strands of DNA. Now that we better understand these words, I will be going into more detail as to why we affirm regulations on CRISPR technology. According to the article, How Should the U.S. Regulate Genetic Testing?, Stanford Law School Center of Law and Bioscience held a conference. In this article, it states that the best takeaway from the day was better regulations of genetic testing is certainly needed. Also in this article, Kathy Hudson from NIH argues that we need a nimble and risk-based regulatory system. She points to President Obama's recent remark that we are going to have to change how we regulate some of this stuff, and advise us to watch this space. This being said, the leader of the free world has stated that genetic engineering needs to be better regulated. Why should the government regulate genetic modifications such as CRISPR? The FDA has stated its concerns that people could withhold necessary treatment or even drop treatment altogether, which could result in illness or death. To clear this up, the FDA fears that genetic engineering could obtain too much power over humankind, leading to dangerous circumstances. In the article, Chinese scientists create CRISPR babies. One risk of CRISPR is that it can introduce accidental or off-targeting mutations, which can lead to death or severe illnesses. Risks such as these are reasons why we affirm more regulations. As of now, the United States has existing regulations on genetic engineering and CRISPR, such as jurisdiction, interagent coordination, containment and standard use of accessing the risk, and lastly, the overview of compatibility and safety efficient requirements. But this is not enough. The government should place restrictions as to where these types of genetic engineering take place. This being said, the government should require all genetic modifications be done in a government-regulated lab. This will allow the government to keep control and overlook the genetic testing in order to ensure that genetic testing does not get out of hand. The government should also add more conditions, such as how far someone can go with these types of modifications, and psychological testing on the individuals using CRISPR/genetic engineering technologies. These conditions should be required in order for someone to be able to access CRISPR technology. Adding more conditions will help avoid genetic engineering for the wrong reasons. With all this being said, regulations such as government-regulated labs and adding more conditions in order to access CRISPR will be beneficial to humankind because genetic engineering will have less control over humanity. Hopefully, with these regulations in mind, we will be able to prevent an unethical modification of any genetic engineering.
We resolve that the U.S. federal government should not increase regulations on CRISPR technology. Whenever considering increased government regulation, we should remember to consider all aspects of the issue. Let's define a few terms. CRISPR stands for clusters of regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats, and In other words, a revolutionary gene editing mechanism that could potentially create a positive future for our society as we know it. The U.S. federal government is a huge bureaucracy run by politicians who are famous for lying to American voters. And finally, government regulations are famous for being written by lobbyists working for the big companies that regulations are supposed to be enforced upon. I know that there are many viewpoints on what we should accomplish as Americans and what our federal government should accomplish, but our government system is not an efficient way to accomplish many things. We need to look at what can realistically be accomplished within these constraints. We also need to remember that our actions in America set standards for research and productivity around the world. America is not always a leader in many scientific aspects, but our research on CRISPR technology has the ability to change the lives of millions or even billions of people around the world. Let's consider the present solution. CRISPR is currently used for a wide range of genetic modifications, including everything from replacing GMO food to theoretical human designer babies. For some, this represents a scary future, but the reality is that CRISPR is already part of our everyday lives. CRISPR allows researchers to easily alter DNA sequences and modify gene function. CRISPR's many potential applications include correcting genetic defects, treating and preventing the spread of diseases, and improving crops. We propose that by increasing regulations on CRISPR, the government would only be postponing scientific development in the U.S. According to Dr. Adriano Flora in Advantages of CRISPR Genome Engineering, since it can be applied directly in embryo, CRISPR-Cas9 reduces the time required to modify target genes compared to gene targeting technologies based on the use of embryonic stem cells. Improved bioinformatics tools to identify the most appropriate sequences to design guide RNAs and an optimization of the experimental conditions enable very robust procedures which guarantee successful introduction of the desired mutation. Therefore, increased regulations would only be stunting a model of gene modification that is arguably the most efficient form of genome editing procedures. CRISPR is already a more effective and quicker form of genetic modification than stem cells, and CRISPR does not present the same ethical and political dilemmas associated with stem cell research. Consider the state of existing research and regulations on CRISPR use in humans. According to The Guardian, doctors at IVF clinics can already test embryos for genetic diseases and pick the healthiest ones to implant into women. If genome editing was safe and effective, it could potentially be used to correct genetic faults in embryos instead of picking those that happen to be healthy. Scientists are currently able to replace a number of genes that cause certain genetic diseases and develop these potentially cured eggs into the embryo stage. However, under UK law, genetically modified embryos cannot be transferred to women. In other words, they are not legally allowed to finish their experiments by implanting them in the womb to see if CRISPR can produce a safe and healthy baby. And similar laws are in place around the world. How can we cure disease if scientists are not allowed to try? Currently, scientists in China are leading the world in CRISPR modification, both in selection of ethically responsible embryos that are otherwise unviable, and in defining whether or not the science of CRISPR is ready for those next steps, based on the likelihood of success. But remember, CRISPR is not just about curing genetic diseases. Consider this subheading from National Geographic. A new technique has the potential to change the foods we eat every day, boosting flavor, disease resistance, and yields, and even tackling allergens like gluten. And scientists say they're working only with nature's own tools. That is Eric Nyler's argument for why gene editing is the next food revolution. Once again, CRISPR is simpler, cheaper, and faster than creating GMOs. Like embryonic stem cells, GMOs have received much negative attention in recent years, though for GMOs it is related to a variety of health and agricultural concerns. CRISPR has the potential to replace GMOs as a new method to improve agriculture. But why is that important? Remember those commercials about feeding poor and starving African children? Two long-term issues are converging to make existing problems in Africa much worse. The Sahara Desert has been expanding further and further south for as long as humans have been able to measure it. Meanwhile, UN studies show that by 2100, Africa's population is set to increase from its current 1 billion people to 4 billion. That's 4 times the number of starving children, and that's just in Africa. And CRISPR is currently our best shot. In In conclusion, increasing the U.S. government's regulation of CRISPR is not going to solve our problems. In fact, it would likely make them worse. CRISPR has the opportunity to end debate about the ethics of stem cells and GMOs by being better, cheaper, and faster. The U.S. federal government would only be postponing scientific development by increasing regulations on CRISPR technology. Finally, CRISPR presents the opportunity to feed people around the world. Do you want to see 4 billion people starve because of regulations written by overweight lobbyists and bureaucrats? This isn't just about so-called designer babies. This is about feeding your tired, your poor, your huddled masses.
Okay, so without more regulations, what's stopping someone from creating something that could potentially destroy the world? I also have an add-on question. Can you expand on how the government regulations have failed?
That's just it. You can't stop someone. We haven't been able to stop guns, nuclear weapons, anything else.
For more regulations on guns.
We're not talking about guns today.
Okay, but you
We're
brought it up.
talking about genetic engineering. It's done in a small lab. We haven't been able to stop nuclear technology in Iran, North Korea, anywhere that wants to do it. Israel
So
even.
now you're talking about nuclear weapons.
I'm saying reality. We cannot prevent genetic
But we can
modifications
help.
in a
So
small scale.
your resolution is to do nothing.
No, my resolution
Is
is to use it for good. Pandora's box has been opened.
Okay, but you
we
can agree
need-
that some people use it for bad.
Yeah, everything's
Okay.
used for bad. But what we need to do is use it for good.
Okay, so regulations will help people use it for good.
And how do you
Okay, you
think
just agreed
that
with me. Thank
using
you.
something for good is a bad thing?
Regulations are not for bad things. Not for good things. They're for bad things. So the government's not going to regulate something that's good.
If you
Agreed?
prevent testing to create the good thing, then you are preventing the good thing.
I'm not preventing testing. I offered government-regulated labs and more.
We already
More
have government
restrictions.
regulated labs. You're asking for more restrictions on something that
What
we're already being
restrictions did I
restricted
ask for that was going to stop?
You just said
something?
increased restrictions. Government regulated labs.
You just said we already have government-regulated labs. So what's stopping someone from? Is that 2 minutes? Thank you.
Sorry, I was getting ready. Okay. So this year, CRISPR has become more well known than ever before, and it raises the question of where the line should be drawn on genetic modification and engineering in humans. So recently, a Chinese scientist claimed to have created genetically modified twin girls using CRISPR technology. The technology was used to delete the CCR5 gene in the girls, which allows HIV to enter and infect the immune systems. But it can also have negative effects. So a CRISPR pioneer at MIT, Zhang, stated that knocking out the CCR5 gene would likely render a person much more susceptible for West Nile virus. So where do we draw the line? Is the risk of one illness greater than another? According to Jennifer Doudna, who is a biochemist at UC Berkeley, she helped develop CRISPR, and she says that there is an urgent need to define the use of gene editing in human embryos to settings where there's a clear unmet medical need and where there is no alternative viable approach. Although one can argue that HIV infection in an infant presents a medical need, there are other ways to prevent HIV from being passed down from a parent that have already been proven to be effective. Sperm washing is a process that helps to ensure that the sperm is not a major reservoir for HIV. According to the World Health Organization, when conducting a study using one of these methods, out of 914 couples, the studies did not report any HIV infections in the women implanted or in the resulting children. Sperm washing dramatically reduces the effects of an infant having HIV. Additionally, Marcy Darnofsky, the executive director of the Center for Genetics in Society, which is a genetic watchdog group, says that we are throwing open the door to a society of genetic have and have-nots, which undermines our chances for a fair and just future. When we think about people being able to edit their children, the way that they want them, it becomes a social hierarchy based on genetics. Suddenly, edited children become higher class, and those who are born naturally become those who are looked down upon. By not regulating what procedures can be done using CRISPR technology, we open the door to a scary future. I know that the negative team also touched on the fact that using CRISPR for food would make more sense to end hunger than like GMOs, but today we have GMOs. We use them all the time. They're widespread in all parts of the world, and you hear about it every day. But there's nothing being done to help the countries that are already in need. We're not sending genetically modified food to these countries, and I want to know if they have a plan to send food to the countries that are in need. If you're saying that we can help them and distribute aid to these countries and potentially end hunger, there has to be a plan in place. I don't think that CRISPR technology having no regulations or just the regulations that we have today would make any sense to end hunger in third world countries such as those in Africa.
All right, so my question is, why are we trusting a government that denies the existence of global warming with any future technologies? On top of this, I mean, just look at them. If we are letting only the government do things, then the government will, they've just announced that they're going to be buying VR helmets that are used for video games to make our troops more deadly in combat situations. We're turning everything into wartime applications. If you're worried about diseases, you need to be worried about the government. Opinions? I mean, if we're going to look at genetic modifying for food as well and helping with starvation, we're already attempting to do that with prepackaged food, prepackaged water, but we don't have crops that can grow in the desert. We need to keep the people from starving in what will rapidly become a changing global climate. We're going to run out of water, we're going to run out of food, we're running out of space to grow things. We need to work now, or it'll be too late by the time it is we finally realize how much we need it. As for the need for better regulations, I would agree that there do need to be more regulations, but I mean, you have to think about who's going to be regulated. Because if we regulate our people, we aren't regulating the people globally. We aren't regulating China, we're not regulating Iran or Europe even. Even Europe has started doing genetic testing on babies with CRISPR. They're genetically testing food for CRISPR. If we don't catch up, we're going to be the third world countries of the future. We're going to be what's left behind. People are going to look down on us. And if we're supposed to lead the world into a bright new future, we need to start working on it. If
2 minutes.
I'm a little short, guys.
Just stand for the press room.
You ready? Wait, yeah.
Yep.
Alright.
Yep.
Alright.
You time. Okay. Okay, so you were talking about only allowing the government to use CRISPR, and that's not what we're asking for. We're not asking for only the government to be allowed to use CRISPR. We're just asking for more government regulations for the U.S. to be able to use it. So not necessarily that only the government would be using it, because I know that you said that our government denies global warming, but our entire government doesn't, just President Trump. And if you look at quotes from his cabinet and everything, they agree that he's completely wrong, that global warming does exist. So it's not just our entire government. It's just our president, who we can all agree probably isn't the brightest. But we're not saying that only the government can use CRISPR. I think that kind of opens the door to a weird future. But I know you said something about we're not regulating the world, which I understand, but in the first speech, she also said that the U.S. sets a precedent for the rest of the world. So how does us having no more regulations help with the rest of the world, who kind of follows suit with what we do? They kind of look to us as, the leader in certain technologies.
did you not mention in your opening speech, not you,
Right.
but mention that only the government should, I'm pretty sure I heard it. If I heard wrong,
So
then
she
my
just said
mistake.
government regulated labs.
Okay, well, I'm pretty sure the government already has government regulated.
Right. No, that's,
So,
we're,
So what's
Go
gonna
ahead.
change?
no, so we're asking for stricter regulations. So, not only, so it's not only government regulated labs, there were also, restrictions, because right now, it seems like the restrictions aren't working. I know you said that that it wasn't the entire world, but there was a U.S. scientist that even Dr. Ling said that was reported to be involved with the Chinese scientists that developed these genetically. Okay, sorry.
Okay, so as my side has previously discussed, our three biggest issues with, and the reason as to why we want to increase regulation, is because there is an issue between ethicality, there are possible side effects and dangers, and there also may be alternative methods to using the CRISPR technology. So, as mentioned, as to the side effects, the FDA has touched on this. And the FDA is the Food and Drug Administration, and this is a federal agency that is actually concerned with this process, which means that it needs to be looked into and that regulations do need to be increased because they're expressing concern over this. And another reason is that without the government regulation, there could be an abuse of power with this type of technology because engineers really don't know their limits and they would like to break those limits, which is why the government is needed for something like this. And another problem with the ethicality is that there could be accidental off-target mutations, as previously mentioned. And in this case, there really needs to be regulation so that that doesn't happen and we don't put other lives in danger because of this. And another reason is that there actually are previous methods, as mentioned, as well, such as the sperm separation, which could be used, and also, as mentioned, also the socioeconomic status could deprive certain individuals from reaching out to this technology, and which means that they could actually be more susceptible without the equal treatment of this, which with the government regulation, it could be able to increase the reach and have more people be able to access such resources. And as the opposition mentioned, I actually quoted you guys saying that the government regulation could postpone scientific research, but this actually is not the case. The government would be making sure that nothing gets out there until it is protected and made sure that it actually does work. And you also mentioned designer babies and how that CRISPR technology is not just trying to produce such babies, but we're not saying that it is either, but it's just that with the possibility of such technology that there is the possible thing that it could be getting out there and creating more designer babies. And you also mentioned how the UK is not allowing these genetically modified embryos to be put into women. And as mentioned before, this is probably because they are not as sure as to what this technology still holds. And it could be affecting the women if it was to happen, which is why, as our side has discussed, increased government regulation is needed to prevent these from happening.
Okay, I just want to pinpoint, all I'm really hearing from y'all's side is the negative, the negative, the negative. I want to talk about some of the positive aspects of CRISPR. There are countless reasons why CRISPR not really shouldn't be regulated in a sense, but it's the fact that, first off, the research that's already being conducted on CRISPR right now is actually done on animals and monkeys, and the embryos that they test on are actually not viable. So we're not hurting anybody. We're not putting any humans in danger. The government and the research that we've done actually agrees with the fact that these embryos should not be tested on humans right now so that we're not putting anybody in danger. So the positive aspects of CRISPR right now are the fact that they could cure diseases that are otherwise have treatments that cost tens of thousands of dollars to people that otherwise need the treatment. So for instance, cystic fibrosis, cancer, AIDS, blindness, blood disorders, Huntington's disease, and muscular dystrophy are all a number of diseases that could be cured by CRISPR. And we're not saying that they have to go in and genetically modify their actual cells. They can actually create pills with CRISPR technology that can be implemented to these patients that will completely cut out costs of chemotherapy, kids that are actually having to take Adderall and Vyvanse and things that could otherwise be harmful to them. This is completely cutting out the cost of these treatments that we're spending this money on anyways. So if we're spending money on pills and treatment for people to have to take for the rest of their lives, why wouldn't we just implement it into one thing that could just knock out the disease to begin with? Other than that, it can reverse aging. Not saying that we're going to take away wrinkles for everybody, but with age comes diseases such as Alzheimer's. I know that we probably have all known somebody or known a friend who's had a grandparent with that, and it's really sad. Genetically modifying these embryos at a very early stage could knock out these diseases for people. Other than that, as far as the regulations that we already have, we are more regulated than any other country at this time. It's not that we're saying that we should be going out there and doing all of this unsafe research to genetically modify humans and babies and put these people at risk. What we're saying is that, obviously, I don't know if y'all have heard about what happened in China, but this scientist has actually given birth to genetically modified babies. That's happening in other countries. We're talking about here. Here is where we're going to get behind if we put all of these regulations on things that are already happening in other countries. So if we can find and develop a way to do that in a much safer way, we could actually be developing a more safe program for these things to happen. So that way, if we are to genetically modify human beings one day, we can make sure that nothing bad will happen to them or happen to them in the future. Other than that, y'all did mention designer babies. Designer babies is actually a myth that's not going to be possible. If you're going to implement blue eyes or athleticism into a human being, it actually has to have 100% it has to be 100% inheritable by the family already. So if somebody wants to genetically modify their kid, that trait actually already has to exist within their ancestral line. So if we're going to talk about designer babies, that's one criteria that just makes it actually impossible. Other than that, there are just so many DNA traits that actually cycle through a human being. So to go in there and genetically modify something to make sure that it's predominantly determined by the DNA, then it actually has to go and modify a specific mutation. So it's actually impossible. No, she's out.
It's green.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
It's green? How long,
Yes.
how long is green?
Do we all stand up for this?
I think
3
we-
minutes.
I
I
think-
think
oh,
Grant's 3 minutes.
Okay, when do you start?
Just stand up when you ask a question. That's probably
Yeah, right, so,
I think Lisa has to go first.
you ready?
So, like, has there been any technology proven to have be able to like create pills with this CRISPR technology yet?
Yeah, basically you're genetically modifying, you would genetically modify an embryo and put it into pill form. So what they're doing right now is they're creating technology that's not going to cure, per se, HIV or cancer, but what they can do is they can actually genetically modify an embryo to have these diseases where they actually can't get it to begin with. So they're going to have 100%, what would you call it? Resistance to the disease already. So if they could put that in a pill form, such as getting a shot to prevent you from getting the flu, they are going to technically put this technology into a pill that you can take that prevents you from even being able to be touched by a disease such as HIV, cancer, all the other ones I mentioned, cystic fibrosis. So you're technically preventing it to begin with.
Right, so that's what they did with the Chinese babies, is they took out the protein or the.
That's a completely different
enzyme.
subject. If you're going to talk about genetically modifying a human before it's born, that's completely different than creating a pill that you can take.
You're talking about preventing diseases, so that's what they did, but there's already a way to prevent that before the
Not,
baby's
can you
even
prevent
born.
HIV?
Yeah,
Can you prevent cancer?
that's what we just talked about with sperm washing.
That do prevent HIV.
Okay, so where's this technology right now for regulating it? Then how are they going to be able to implement it to
No,
patients?
it's already in place.
Yeah.
It already happens all the time.
Inherited HIV.
Right, which
You
is
can't
what they
prevent
did
it.
with those
I have a
babies.
question.
And also, when you have HIV, you can take medicine to prevent you from getting AIDS. HIV is just an autoimmune disease that makes your immune system more susceptible for you to get AIDS.
But by putting it in a pill, you're not preventing getting AIDS. You're curing AIDS. There's a difference there.
Okay, so with technology forever changing, do you think that the regulations we have now will apply to future technologies?
What's going on, the technology that's going on is already in place. It's already in action.
Yeah, I know, but technology is forever growing. Like the iPhone 1 was the iPhone 1, and now it's the iPhone 10. So, therefore, do you think the regulations we have right now, which you don't want to change, are going to be efficient to the ones in the future when we have more things?
If we let it go right now and we change it now, we're jumping the gun. If we wait till things are different
But
and
we're
then
not saying
keep
to
up with
change it
things,
now. We're saying to change it eventually. It's going to have to happen, right?
everything's
You
going to happen
agree?
eventually, but it could be
So
100
you
years
agree-
before we're ready.
you
But
agree
you're arguing
that
about
we
changing
need-
things now.
No, I'm not.
You're saying that
I
now
said
in 5
the
years,
future.
10 years, we should
In
do
the
it?
future.
You keep saying more regulations. So far, the only thing you've actually suggested specifically
Is government labs,
is
which we have already.
Yeah, but are the
government
genetic
labs, and
engineering
it's monitoring
things-
our
It is.
scientists to prevent them from working with
That
others.
was it. That was. I feel impossible. Like there is a mountain inside of my chest. I can feel the rocks in my lungs, the concrete in my cardiac. I feel big. I smell strong. I am like a giant in the body of a lion. I am at the very peak of my existence. I can feel the indecision in the wind swaying backwards, swaying forwards. It's thinking about trying to knock someone like me over, but I ain't never seen no breeze knock no mountain over, so I'm telling you, I feel impossible. Turning on the tank ball. Right now, genetic engineers have the ability to feel impossible, to feel unstoppable, because they have no one governing them and telling them what counts as ethical and what doesn't. Yes, the United States does have existing regulations on CRISPR, such as contamination and standards used for assessing the risk, but there is no restriction on how far someone can go with the type of modifications. Right now, a genetic engineer has the power to choose who is eligible for the procedure, and they have the ability to do as much as they want with the genetic code. This is why we need stricter government regulation on CRISPR technology. We are not suggesting that the government needs to seize full control, but we are pushing for technologies like CRISPR to stay more ethical with their planning and execution of the procedures. The idea of a government lab is something that we talked about, and it's a great advantage to our affirmation because if the government is monitoring what's happening in the lab, we can make sure that the genetic testing can avoid getting out of hand. Their only argument is that the government is corrupt and that they can't handle anything. They have not supplied any evidence that the government could not regulate the CRISPR technology. They brought up some good ideas, but none of them suggested why we shouldn't regulate CRISPR, which is what we're actually debating about. They just kept explaining what CRISPR does, and we are not discounting that, but we are saying that we need more regulations for it. In conclusion, we affirm that the resolved that genetic engineering / CRISPR should be in fact more regulated and enforced by the government. You should vote AF because they each three of them, all of them went and talked about regulations. Like each time they all said we have to regulate CRISPR technology. They all went against what they're talking about individually. So why would you vote for somebody who doesn't even vote for themselves? Thank you.
All right, and for our side to conclude, I just want to first off say that it's not that we want more regulations. We want safe regulations. Let me just say one thing, CRISPR is already illegal. So to say that we need to regulate something that's already illegal makes absolutely no sense, for one. And I just want to say that the regulations that are already implemented in the way they are already safe. I already mentioned in my last speech that monkeys are being tested on right now. We have embryos that are otherwise not valid to society that are being worked on right now. These regulations that are already in place do not need to be changed. They exist the way they are, and for us to flourish as a country and catch up with these other countries that are already in a state where they're going beyond the means that we even have right now to be able to catch up to them. That's not what America is about. America is about being the leaders of our society. Everybody looks to us and to our government for help, always. So why should we put ourselves behind in a sense to where other countries could almost be ahead of us, and it could end up being a danger to our society in the end. Other than that, what our team promotes is that we want everybody in our society to live healthier, cheaper lives. We want people to be able to access these CRISPR technologies for the benefit of themselves, for our children, for our grandparents, for things that otherwise are not tangible to us in our society right now. And all we are asking for is that CRISPR is able to flourish and continue in these studies that are already being done in a safe environment in already government regulated facilities, and that we're able to let the scientists go do their work and be able to finish a project that has already been started.
That's it.
Thank you. Good job. Good job.
I was really doing this like 15 more minutes to argue. I'm good at arguing, I'm not good at presenting.
We can, oh, Lord, that was something, boy.
Yeah, I agree.
Great job, everyone.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. I'm sorry, like, I don't know, I feel like it got a little heated, but I mean, it
I've seen
happened.
worse.
Okay,
I've
good.
seen
I heard
worse.
all of them have been kind of heated.
Yeah, people like
Yeah.
knocking over chairs. No, you're
Yeah, I-
stupid. I'm like, oh.
See, no, we didn't do none of that.
Insult the concept, not the person.
Yeah.
Wait, really? They like,
Yeah, when I took this class.
No.
Yes, and I was like, ooh.
You're like, let me get up real quick.
Excuse me.
I was like, somebody stop the timer. I'm gonna tell them something.
No, I don't want it.
I want it.
I mean, she's like, give me the
Wants the
video.
video. Wait, you should stop recording.
Still recording. Can you?
What button?
The red.